In the decade preceding the German invasion of June 1941, the vast rural expanses of the Soviet Union had been transformed into a landscape of profound trauma and systemic violence. Under Joseph Stalin's first five-year plan, launched in 1929, the Soviet state had embarked on a brutal campaign of forced agricultural collectivization, stripping millions of peasant families of their private holdings, livestock, and ancestral lands. Those who resisted, labeled as kulaks or wealthy exploiters, were systematically arrested, executed, or deported to the frozen wilderness of Siberia and the Urals in a campaign of state-sponsored terror known as dekolkhozation. The pooling of land into state-controlled collective farms, known as kolkhozes, and state farms, known as sovkhozes, destroyed the traditional fabric of Slavic rural life, replacing a highly motivated peasant economy with an inefficient, heavily bureaucratic system designed solely for the ruthless extraction of grain to feed Soviet cities and fuel heavy industrialization. In Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, this policy culminated in the Holodomor of 1932 and 1933, a state-engineered artificial famine that claimed the lives of millions of Ukrainian peasants through systematic starvation, leaving an indelible scar of visceral hatred and deep resentment toward the Bolshevik regime. When the columns of German Wehrmacht tanks and infantry surged across the Soviet border during the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa, they did not find a unified Soviet citizenry ready to die for the hammer and sickle. Instead, throughout the Baltic states, Belarus, and Ukraine, the advancing Axis soldiers were frequently greeted as genuine liberators, with rural populations offering the traditional welcoming gifts of bread and salt, desperately hoping that the arrival of Western forces would signal the immediate destruction of the hated collective farm system and the return of their stolen private lands. Historically, the immense political and psychological capital presented by this peasant welcome was squandered in what would become one of the most disastrous strategic blunders of the entire war. Within the Nazi leadership, a fierce ideological and administrative debate erupted regarding the management of the conquered Eastern territories. Alfred Rosenberg, the head of the Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories, or Ostministerium, advocated for a policy of dividing and conquering the Soviet Union by granting autonomy and private land ownership to non-Russian nationalities, particularly the Ukrainians, to turn them against Moscow. However, Rosenberg's proposals were aggressively crushed by the ruthless Reichskommissar of Ukraine, Erich Koch, and the State Secretary of the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, Herbert Backe. Backe was the principal architect of the infamous Hunger Plan, a deliberate starvation policy designed to feed the German Wehrmacht and home population by extracting millions of tons of grain from the Soviet Union, even if it meant the starvation of up to 30 million local inhabitants. Backe and Koch realized that extracting grain from millions of tiny, independent peasant farms would be an administrative nightmare, whereas keeping Stalin's highly centralized kolkhoz system intact allowed the German agricultural officers, or Landwirtschaftsführer, to simply take over the existing administrative machinery of extraction. Renamed communal farms or Gemeinschaftsbetrieb, the collective farms remained virtually unchanged, with the peasants forced to work under the whip of German overseers just as they had under Soviet commissars. This profound betrayal, coupled with the brutal execution of hostages, the systematic burning of villages, and the forced deportation of millions of young peasants to Germany as slave labor or Ostarbeiter, shattered any illusions of German liberation. Desperate and furious, the rural populations realized they had merely traded one brutal master for another, driving hundreds of thousands of peasants into the dense forests to form the core of a massive, highly destructive partisan movement that would ultimately paralyze German railway and road logistics in the rear of the Osttheer. In our alternate timeline, the strategic crisis of late summer 1941 triggers a dramatic ideological pivot in Berlin. As the Wehrmacht suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties and realized that the Soviet state would not collapse in a single, swift campaign, pragmatic officers within the military command and the Ministry for the occupied Eastern Territories successfully stage an administrative coup. Backed by General Eduard Wagner, the Quartermaster General of the Army, and key field commanders who witnessed the rapid rise of anti-German resistance behind the front lines, these pragmatists present Adolf Hitler with an ultimatum. Either secure the cooperation of the Eastern peasantry to stabilize the army's rear, or face a terminal logistical collapse. Overriding the objections of Backe and Koch, the pragmatic faction forces the immediate enactment of the Agrarian Decree of September 1941. This sweeping historical document declares the immediate and permanent dissolution of all collective and state farms across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, officially ending Stalinist collectivization. Under the decree, the land, livestock, and surviving agricultural machinery of the kolkhozes are systematically divided and deeded back to the local peasants as private, hereditary property. German administrative officers are stripped of their punitive extraction powers and replaced by regional peasant cooperatives designed to assist in the equitable distribution of land plots. By restoring private property rights, the Axis commands transform the socio-political landscape of the East overnight, positioning themselves not as exploitative conquerors, but as the true guarantors of the peasants' ancestral dream of land ownership, completely undermining the Soviet Union's ideological claim to represent the working masses. The execution of the Agrarian Gambit triggers a profound, immediate logistical transformation across the rear areas of the Eastern Front, altering the strategic balance of the war by late 1941. Historically, the Wehrmacht was forced to commit dozens of security divisions, Hungarian units, and frontline troops to protect its overextended supply lines from devastating partisan railway demolitions and convoy ambushes. In this alternate scenario, the primary recruitment pool for the Soviet partisans is completely extinguished. The rural peasantry, now possessing a concrete, highly valuable vested interest in their private farms, views any return of Soviet authority as a direct threat to their newly acquired property. Peasant communities actively organize local self-defense militias, known as Selbstschutz, to hunt down Soviet infiltrators, protect their harvests, and guard local railway bridges against sabotage. Consequently, the primary supply arteries of the Wehrmacht, particularly the vital railway lines linking the Baltic ports to Leningrad and the Brest-Litovsk to Moscow railway trunk, operate with near-perfect security, allowing the German Reichsbahn to move ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements to the front lines with unprecedented speed and efficiency. Furthermore, the agricultural output of the private farms experiences a dramatic surge. Rather than engaging in passive resistance, crop burning, and hoarding, the highly motivated private farmers actively cultivate every acre of land, utilizing traditional farming techniques to maximize yields. A highly lucrative, voluntary trade system emerges where the Wehrmacht barters industrial tools, salt, textiles, and captured Soviet-manufactured goods directly with the peasant cooperatives for grain, meat, and vegetables. This voluntary extraction system successfully feeds the millions of soldiers of the Oster on site, entirely relieving the strained German domestic railway system of the burden of hauling food from Central Europe to the Eastern Front, while also providing a stable, substantial surplus of grain to feed the civilian populations of the occupied cities, neutralizing the historical food crises that crippled the region. Beyond the immediate stabilization of the Wehrmacht's logistics, the Agrarian Gambit unleashes a massive, historically unprecedented military manpower shift that fundamentally alters the demographic math of the Eastern Front. Historically, the German military utilized a limited number of local auxiliaries, or Hilfswillige, primarily in non-combat, logistical roles due to deep-seated Nazi racial prejudices that viewed Slavic populations as subhumans unfit to bear arms. Under our counterfactual scenario, the successful defense of private property rights fosters an intense, widespread anti-Bolshevik loyalty among the rural youth. Leveraging this massive groundswell of support, the Wehrmacht commanders established the Peasant Guard divisions and dramatically expand the recruitment of regional volunteer forces, or Ostlegionen. Highly motivated young men from Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states enlist by the hundreds of thousands, eager to defend their newly won private lands from the Red Army's advance. By the summer of 1942, over 1 million heavily armed Eastern volunteer troops are integrated into the Axis order of battle, organized into cohesive, well-trained division-strength units under the command of native officers and German advisors. These Ostlegionen proved to be highly effective, resilient combat forces, possessing a deep knowledge of the local terrain, climate, and Soviet tactical doctrine. They are deployed to hold quiet sectors of the massive front line, guard vital choke points, and secure the flanks of the German armored thrusts. This massive influx of fresh, highly motivated manpower effectively offsets the severe attrition suffered by the German infantry during the winter battles of 1941, allowing the German High Command to maintain a far higher density of forces across the entire Eastern Front, and freeing up elite German divisions to concentrate their armored power for devastating offensive campaigns. Yet, despite the spectacular logistical successes and the massive military contributions of the Peasant Guard divisions, the Agrarian Gambit ultimately runs headfirst into a terminal, unyielding industrial bottleneck that exposes the entire campaign as an unsustainable strategic mirage. In a total war of global logistics, a stable agricultural sector cannot exist in a vacuum. It requires a continuous, high-volume supply of industrial inputs, including steel plowshares, tractors, refined chemical fertilizers, coal, and spare parts. By late 1942, Nazi Germany's highly militarized, overstretched war economy is completely incapable of manufacturing these civilian agrarian goods. Under the crushing pressure of Allied strategic bombing in the West and the insatiable demand for tanks, artillery, and ammunition in the East, German factories are fully mobilized for war production, leaving absolutely no industrial capacity to manufacture consumer goods or agricultural machinery for the Eastern peasantry. The occupation Reichsmarks issued by the German authorities rapidly lose all value, as there are simply no consumer goods in the occupied markets for the peasants to buy with their paper money. Consequently, the trade network between the Wehrmacht and the private farmers rapidly collapses, reverting to primitive, highly inefficient barter systems where food is traded only for immediate tactical essentials. Without machinery and chemical fertilizers, the soil of the private farms is rapidly depleted and agricultural productivity plummets, causing widespread local famines that undermine the peasantry's loyalty. Meanwhile, behind the Urals, the Soviet Union, fueled by the massive, high-velocity industrial assembly lines of the Urals military complexes and the uninterrupted torrent of American Lend-Lease trucks, steel, and high-octane fuel, reorganizes its massive mechanized forces. In the end, no amount of localized tactical loyalty or secure rear logistics can overcome the crushing, multi-front industrial and demographic weight of the global Allied coalition, proving that in the 20th century's war of total industrial mobilization, a brilliant agrarian policy can never defeat the assembly line output of an industrialized continent.